Hi everyone, I'm Helena Cobban. I'm the president of Just World Educational, and I'd like to welcome you to this 5th session of our 10-part webinar series, Commonsense on Syria, in which I'll have a conversation with Syrian historian Sami Moubayed about the massive continuing role that Israel has played in Syrian public life since 1948. I'm glad so many people have joined us already. I'll give newcomers just a minute to settle in. And while you do so, I'll remind you of a few things about this Zoom webinar, which is a little different than the Zoom meetings you may have been taking part in recently. The webinar is more like an in-person seminar or a public presentation, in that there are the main speakers, in this case, Dr. Moubayed and I, while most of the people in this room, in this virtual room, are attendees whom we seek to engage in an orderly way that allows for reasoned discussion. The other people in the room here are our Just World elves who work behind the scenes to answer your process questions and to receive and organize the questions on substance that you may want to ask. Our chief elf is our board member, Dr. Alice Rothschild. Please note that we are not using the Q&A capability that some Zoom webinars have. So if you want to ask a question of Dr. Moubayed, can you do so via the chat box that you'll find if you send your cursor down near the bottom of your Zoom window. Plus, if you want your question to have a chance of being actually asked, word it succinctly and have it be an actual question. Our elves do not have the time to read through long rants and screeds. We also ask you to keep your questions to the topic of today's session. We have 5 more sessions coming after today, each on a different aspect of the Syrian conflict. So please keep today's questions to today's topic, which is Israel's role in Syria, and keep them brief. Another thing I'll do as we go along is maybe launch 1 or more little snap polls for you to participate in. Here's one now. By the way, we have 89 participants already. This is pretty exciting. And okay, here is your poll for today. Well, your first poll anyway. Okay, while you're looking at that, you can fill that one out as you listen along. So today I am very happy to welcome to the webinar Dr. Sami Moubayed, speaking with us from the coronavirus lockdown he's undergoing in his home in Damascus. Dr. Sami is the author of 9 books on different aspects of Syria's history. Dr. Sami, thanks for being with us today.
Thank you, Helena. It's great to be here, and it's great to see you after so many years. Thank you for having me.
I'm really delighted to reconnect with you. And here, by the way, is the cover of the book of Dr. Sami's that I urge you to buy and read. Under the Black Flag.
It's a 2015 publication in London.
And it is available.
Please drop the doctor, just call me Sami.
Okay. So it is available as an ebook. So even though the market in physical books has collapsed, you can get this and download it and read it on your Kindle. It's a history not just of ISIS, Daesh, but it's a thoroughgoing account of the history of Islamist extremist fighting forces in Syria and Iraq, including Jabhat al-Nusra, which was the precursor to the organization currently controlling Idlib. Under the Black Flag also has a useful and informative chapter about the tens of thousands of foreign fighters who flocked to the areas that ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra wrested control of in Syria, many of whom are still there. But today, Dr. Sami and I will be talking about the role that a different foreign force, Israel, has been playing in Syrian politics. We'll take a quick gallop through the relations the 2 countries had before 2011, and then spend the latter half of our discussion today talking about the situation since 2011. So first, Dr. Sami, let's look at the period between 1948 and 1967. what would you describe relations between the two countries in those years as being like? By the way, I'm going to stop that poll now. So, okay, let's just give all our attention to Dr. Sami.
Well, it's quite known that many Syrians of the generation that was around in 1948 had considered Palestine to be part of Greater Syria, and they actually called it Southern Syria. There was this tremendous amount of zeal and desire to liberate. This long before the 1948 creation of the State of Israel, there was this desire to retake Palestine, to liberate Palestine. 1936, there was a revolt against the British in Palestine, which was funded and supported and by the Syrians, by both public and government alike. In 1948, there was this tremendous push for what was labeled back then as jihad, by the way, to fight in Palestine. Many people enlisted for the Army of Deliverance, the Jaysh al-Inqaz, that was created by the Arab League, defeated in late 1947. By mid-1948, when it was quite clear that the State of Israel was going to be announced, Syria began to mobilize for an official entry into that war, knowing perfectly well, by the way, that they were going to be defeated because the army was very ill-equipped, having just emerged from 26 years of French colonialism. Yet they went ahead and they entered the battle, and they were actually defeated. And because of the street pressure, and because people were so anti-Western, anti-American, anti-Israeli, the Syrians were actually the last country to join the peace talks, the UN-mandated ceasefire talks with Israel. It took a coup in Damascus, the first military coup in Syria's modern history, to topple the nationalists who were in power, to bring forth a military ruler who was willing to accommodate Western aspirations and who has been generally accused of being on American payroll, being General Hosni Zaim. He started peace talk. He launched the ceasefire talks with Israel, and he went quite far in trying to negotiate an agreement which people generally don't talk about. I think that is a very significant chapter and forgotten chapter of the modern history of Syria and Israel, which Itamar Rabinovich has written about in his book, The Road Not Taken. That was a missed opportunity. The Syrians were willing to go for peace at the time. It was David Ben-Gurion who said no. From a perspective being, I have just defeated and smashed the Arab armies combined. Why in the world should I negotiate with a crushed army and a defeated nation? So it was Israel that turned down the offer, which was on the table many years before Anwar Sadat showed up in Jerusalem in 1977. After the Hosni Zaim interlude, we had the chapter of support for Palestinian militants, starting with Fatah and running through all other groups that emerged all the way up to Hamas and Islamic Jihad. We had the second official Arab-Israeli war in 1967, which added further antagonism and hatred and a feeling of defeat and anger because of the second crushing of the Syrian army and the occupation of the Golan and East Jerusalem and Sinai and the West Bank. A war of attrition followed that, led by Egypt.
Hi, Sami, this is amazing. Thank you so much for giving us this much. Like, you did it so fast. I'm going to just break in and share a map that I have of Golan and what happened in 1967 in Golan. In fact, this map also shows what happened in 1948-49 between Syria and Israel. So this map shows, obviously, the occupied Golan is in sort of a light tan color. The purple splotch is what the United Nations is supposed to be controlling. Now, the portion that interests me is also what we see, the orange portion. So you can see on this map that 1923 international boundary that was negotiated between Mr. Sykes and Mr. Picot, two obviously European imperialist people. That's the dashed line. And actually you talked about the Jaish al-Inqadh, the Salvation Army that intervened in 1947-48. And they managed to take a little portion of, the north of Palestine. And that's really the portion that is orange there. So the Armistice Line is the one that's to the left of the orange portion. So the thing about that is that the orange portion was supposed to be a demilitarized zone. Under those negotiations that you described of 1949, the Syrian government agreed to withdraw the forces back to the international boundary. And what was left, the orange, was supposed to be demilitarized, but the Israelis pushed in, first of all, tractors and then armed tractors. And so the Syrians understandably responded by trying to stop the incursion of the armed tractors. I'm saying this because the way that Zionist historiography in this country commonly, I want to stop sharing that, the way that Zionist historiography commonly describes what was happening prior to 67 is that these innocent Israeli farmers were trying to farm their lands and Syrian gunners were just violently shelling them from on top of the Golan Heights. So it's very useful to understand that that's not exactly what was happening. I have actually a reading here and I'm going to share this one. Okay, I'm still figuring out how to, by the way, we've got 111 people on the, this is great.
Impressive.
Yeah, okay, I'm going to share this one. So this is your book, obviously.
Thank you.
And then there's a book by somebody called General Odd Bull, who was a Norwegian who was the commander of the UN forces in,
yes.
In Syria and Israel. I guess it was the ISMAC. And this is his memoir. And I urge anybody who's interested in this period to go and read General Odd Bull's memoir, which you can find on Amazon. And then there's my book, but my book is later and by comparison less important than Odd Bull's or yours. So,
during the armistice talks that took place, there's an entire part of them that was related to day-to-day affairs, joint efforts in combating insects on the border, what to do if a ship sails into territorial waters, what to do in terms of medical assistance if there is a plague, or there were entire side talks, and some of those talks actually took place inside, across the border area. So what you're mentioning is the Lake Houla incident, Al-Houla, where the Israelis started drilling, and this was in violation of what the Syrians believed to be their understanding of the border agreement. And the Syrians nudged civilians and shepherds to open fire as a message to the IDF to stay away. The Israelis never believed that, and they always accused the Syrians of triggering those incidents. And there's an entire historical debate on who started what and whether it was Syrian officialdom that was firing. It was nudged by the Syrians, because nobody could have entered the demilitarized area without the approval of the Syrian government. We're talking the early 1950s here. But this was for a reason. This was to make a point that we are still committed to Palestine. And even when the military regime started to unfold in Syria one after another, the argument that they put forth is that we lost one battle with Israel. We did not lose the war. We are just preparing and regrouping and rearming ourselves for another war, which they lost in 1967. all the way up to 1973. Now, the important thing about 1967, Helena, is the borderline that became the basis for all the peace talks that took place from Madrid onwards, which was the Syrian official position was no longer to end the state of Israel and no longer to liberate what they called historical Palestine, but just to return to the June 1967 borderline, which also has not been achieved, as I'm sure we'll be touching upon in upcoming parts of this discussion.
That's right. I mean, from 1991 onward, Madrid, there were several attempts to negotiate a final Syrian-Israeli peace. Just before we get to that, I'm going to take the liberty here, since I've had the chance to actually go to Golan, which I guess, Sami, you have not. And I'll describe it just very, very quickly. So Golan, when you get there, it's a beautiful broad elevated plateau that goes up to and includes the summit of Jebel al-Sheikh, which is the major mountain there, sometimes known as Mount Hermon. And the thing about Mount Hermon and those summit areas is they overlook not just northern Israel, but also great swathes of Lebanon, plus large areas of the rest of Syria, including to and far beyond Damascus. So it's a very strategic place that dominates the region, dominates a huge chunk of Syria, as well as, you know, those other portions I mentioned. So the plateau is extremely fertile. It has rain-fed agriculture and was always just a breadbasket for the whole region. In 1967, most of the Golan's residents fled with the Syrian army because the rout of the army was so complete and so demoralizing. Only villagers in 5 villages in the north remained in their homes, and this was for historical reasons. So now you have them and their descendants still living there, Syrian citizens living under total Israeli control in Golan, about 25,000 of them. So the Israelis annexed Golan in 1981 and stole most of the land and resources, but you still have these indigenous Syrian citizens living there. And I just really want people to try to connect with some of the human rights issues that those Syrian citizens living under Israeli occupation, some of the human rights issues that they face. So this is the best organization I can send you to. It's called Al-Marsad, and they have a very robust presence on Facebook, and you can get all kinds of great resources if you go to their Facebook page and probably their website as well. So what else?
That annexation, by the way, is considered null and void by the international community. Nobody recognized it until last year, until President Trump did. But
yeah, but actually, you know, President Trump doesn't get to determine what is legal and what is illegal under international law. Thank God. So, you know, first of all, Jerusalem, he recognized that annexation, and then Golan, he recognized that annexation. So going back to the broader history of Syrian-Israeli relations, there was this 1973 war, as Sami mentioned, and then since 1990, basically 1991, you had the, sorry, what's happening here? 1991, you had the Madrid Peace Conference, and after that, you had direct negotiations between Syria and Israel. So, Sami, can you tell us a little bit about those negotiations that have taken place on and off since 1991?
Madrid was in direct response to Syria's participation in the liberation of Kuwait, and it was, we all know that there was a great desire with the Bush administration to have overwhelming Arab support for that liberation, so as it not be viewed as an American intervention between two Arab states. And Syria took part in that. It was, quote unquote, rewarded with a US brokered, it was actually jointly brokered by the Americans and the Russians, but Madrid was the start of the end of Russian influence in the region as we knew it before that, and the beginning of American presence, which lasted throughout the Bush and Clinton and George W. Bush eras. So they sponsored those talks. The Syrians attended, and then they went into the other aside talks that were called the Washington talks. That led to a series of meetings between then Foreign Minister of Syria and the Israelis, all the way up to March 2000, which was the last summit between Hafez al-Assad and Bill Clinton, which failed to produce a peace treaty. Those talks collapsed in the summer of 2000 when President Assad died, and they resumed under Turkish mediation in 2008. 2008 were indirect talks. The 1990s were direct talks under American auspices. None of them have succeeded in providing in anything fruitful. Although there was what we call a deposit. It was the Rabin deposit, which was deposited in the hands of President Clinton, offering a full withdrawal from the Golan, a return to the June 1967 borderline in exchange for normalization with Israel. Again, that did not happen because of the assassination of I think it was November 1995, assassination of Itzhak Rabin. So it's been, those were 10 years of talks that actually led to nowhere. They could have produced something very viable because there was a desire for peace in the United States. There was a desire for peace in Israel and in Syria. And at the backdrop of the Wadi Araba Jordanian-Israeli peace talks of treaty of 1994 and Oslo, which was at its peak at the time, September 1993, it would have been very doable. As time passed, it became more difficult. And at this stage, I think the Syrian people are are too consumed with their own economic worries and their own problems to engage in such a process for now. The golden moment in history was the 1990s, and it was a missed opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, what actually killed it in 1996 was when Netanyahu was elected. First of all, Rabin was assassinated, and then Netanyahu was elected, and he pulled out. And it's gotten worse and worse since then, definitely.
Yes.
It is, to me, it's kind of interesting that in the 1990s, it was Washington that was trying to mediate these peace talks, whereas, as you mentioned, by 2008, it had moved to Turkey. So actually, the Washington really wasn't interested, it seems, by 2008, and it was Turkey that was much more invested in trying to get something to happen. And I gather from friends who know Turkish leaders better than I do that actually the failure of the Turks to mediate that Israeli-Syrian peace was one of the major reasons that Turkey that President Erdogan threw up his hands and said, you know, can't deal with President Bashar al-Assad, let's just join the regime change project. But and that, you know, it all kind of happened roughly at the same time. So now here we are, 2011. What can you tell us about Israel's involvement in Syria since the beginning of the conflict?
2011, actually, on day one, Israel took us a very reluctant and wait and see policy, allowing regional players to lead the anti-regime camp, being Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey. That stance began to change in 2011 when armed groups began appearing on the borderline with Israel, and with the withdrawal of UN forces, of UNIFIL. Israel suddenly found itself more seriously involved in the Syrian conflict, facing the major risk in as much as it wanted regime change in Damascus, in as much as it had to think twice, because it was clear by then that the most powerful elements in the armed opposition were the radicals and the Islamists and the Al-Qaeda affiliated, then called Jabhat al-Nusra, now called Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. So there was a reluctance here to push for a full, there were contacts, but there was a reluctance to push for a full regime change agenda, fearing that the alternative for Israel would be very, very serious and dangerous. What Israel has concentrated on since 2012 is curbing Hezbollah's influence in Syria and clipping the wings of Iran. And through its almost weekly violations of Syrian airspace, it has been striking at positions held either by the Iranians or by Hezbollah, without directly striking at the Syrian army until recently. That changed, those rules of engagement changed just last year. I think the Israelis were very much hoping that things would be different in the south, but it was clear by 2015 that the regime was going nowhere, that the Russians were there to stay, and that the powerful elements of the opposition were the Islamic forces. That is why when in 2018 the Russians negotiated the reconciliation agreements in the Syrian south, they made sure that all the militants are shipped off to the north, or that they join the Russian-led reconciliation process. However, after the return of UNIFIL, what the Russians offered Israel was a double buffer on the border area, where there would be.
Isn't it Andof? I mean, UNIFIL was in Lebanon, so this.
Sorry, I'm sorry. It's Andof. Yes. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Yes, it is Andof. UNIFIL is in Lebanon. What the Russians offered was a double buffer on the border, where there would be Israeli troops, UNDOF, Russian troops, then the Syrian army, because Israel was saying at the time that they do not trust that the Syrian army returns single-handedly to the border area, that it would be infiltrated with Hezbollah, and there would be a presence for ISIS, which was powerful through the Khalid ibn al-Walid army in the Syrian south. So at this stage, that border has been secured by the Russians. At present, there are talks to create a similar scenario on the Syrian-Turkish border. We're not there yet. At present, there is no problem at that border, but at the same time, there is no momentum for peace. And the question remains, and this is something that we should think about: have the Russians they have taken control of so many elements of the Middle East. Have they are they taking over the peace process at one stage? Are they going to negotiate a peace at one stage between Israel and Syria? They certainly have the leverage in Israel. They're very close, and they've got that leverage in Syria. Have they yanked the right to of being a peacemaker from the Americans? We're yet to see.
Have they yanked it from the Yanks, indeed?
Yes.
That's an interesting supposition. So go back a little bit prior to 2018. There was this sort of good fence policy that looked very familiar to me from the good fence policy that Israel had in Lebanon, that they launched in 1976 in Lebanon, through which they beefed up, their allies in South Lebanon. And
the South Lebanon Army of Antoine Lahad, they did try to create something similar in Syria through Islamic militants in the south, and that did not work. There were people, armed militants in the armed groups of the Syrian south who were willing to play the role of Antoine Lahad, but that did not happen. There are many who are willing to collaborate with Israel in the Syrian opposition. This is a very, very sad reality, and they believe, you know, there is this feeling in the Arab world that if Israel supports you, then you go ahead with flying colors, and nobody will stop your project, whatever it may be. And there are people who are willing to work publicly with Israel as stooges, as Antoine Lahad had been, to achieve their end results, but that did not work. And the Syrian street remains overwhelmingly anti-Israeli, overwhelmingly pro-Palestinian, although economic woes at present might give them different priorities, but the anger is still there. The feeling of having been robbed of your land and denied of your rights and subjugated to a very brutal occupation remains very much intact in Damascus. In as much as many have tried to say that because of their economic woes, Syrians have forgotten the Palestinian cause, that's not true, by the way.
Interesting. I think now it would be good to actually open things up, because we've had a lot of great questions coming in. So could I bring in our chief elf, or any of the elves, Dr. Alice Rothschild, and could you tell us what's on people's minds?
Okay, well, there are a lot of good questions coming through. So I'm going to start with a question from Judy Houghton. Numerous Israeli experts indicate that Israel does not need to retain the occupied Golan for security imperatives or strategic depth. Why does Israel continue to insist that it must?
Well, first of all, it's a negotiating card for when the peace process launched in Madrid. The Syrians were very clear, our bottom line is the liberation of the Golan, and the Israelis were saying we are willing to negotiate on the Golan, and Rabin was saying we are willing to give up the Golan in exchange for conditions, and those conditions are much more vital for Israel if they are achieved than the Golan itself, being normalization with Syria, being an ending of support for Hezbollah, and at the time a prime condition was ending support for Hamas and Islamic Jihad. As far as the Israelis are concerned, if they give up the Golan and they are rewarded with a break between Syria and Hezbollah, or a destruction of Hezbollah and a destruction of Hamas, that certainly would be more rewarding and more beneficial for Israel's security than keeping the Golan. I think we've got two camps inside Israel. We've got people who are willing to give up the Golan. We have people like Netanyahu who are saying that the Golan is very strategic territory, very fertile territory, the water reservoir of Israel, and we are not willing to give it up. It depends what kind of government you have inside Israel and where the mood stands on peace, or the overall peace process with the Arabs. Now is not the right moment to talk about any of this, because neither Netanyahu is interested, and apparently due to what we've seen from the deal of the century, nor is President Trump.
So this is a question from Peter Ford. Could you expand on what you said about Russia possibly mediating a Syro-Israeli agreement? Surely the chances of Israel ceding territory are nil.
Clearly, the Russians are playing a more active role, not only in Syria, but throughout the region, even in Lebanon and even in Egypt. And the more embedded they become in regional affairs, the more they will have to touch upon this vital issue, which is the backbone of most Middle East politics, the Arab-Israeli conflict. Now, Russia stands in a very suitable position, with excellent terms with Israel and excellent terms with all Arab states, including Syria, which is the only Arab state that really, and Lebanon, which has not signed the peace treaty. is Putin going to go a step further with his Middle East ambitions and try to position himself as a peacemaker in the Arab-Israeli conflict? Whether he has been given that role by the Americans or whether he forcefully snatched it away from them because of lack of ability or lack of interest is something to be debated. Judging by Putin's track record, he will eventually touch on that. Not this year, not next year, not the year after, but eventually we're going to get there.
And from Smadar Lavi, what is the relationship between the assassination of Rabin and peace negotiations with Syria?
Ishaq Rabin was a man who had plenty of war medals on his uniform, meaning he could take bold decisions when it came to peace. You always need to be an accredited war hero to take bold decisions. And in his peace talks with the Syrians, he was offering to relinquish the Golan in the famous Rabin deposit, which took the peace talks back then to new heights. And those heights collapsed with the assassination of Rabin. Peres came next, then it was Netanyahu who completely distanced himself from the so-called Rabin deposit, and the talks ended on that note in 2000.
I can just jump in here because this was what I wrote one of my books about. So this is the book. It's called The Syrian-Israeli Peace Talks of 1991.
It's a beautiful book.
Oh, thank you. Not as beautiful as yours, Sami. But I mean, one of the things that I noticed in the book and it was the fact that was the way that Rabin played off the Palestinians against the Syrians in the negotiations. Like he would prioritize Oslo and then he would go back and prioritize the Syrian track, and he played them off against each other like a maestro. And if only the Palestinians and the Syrians had been able to get together and coordinate at that time, the position of both of them, I think, would have been a lot stronger. That's one thing. Another is that after the assassination of Rabin, Peres, who immediately acceded to power, had a choice to make between nailing, because they were very close, as Sami said, they were very close to having the peace agreement with Syria. Peres made a choice between nailing that down and then going to an election, or going to an election and then proceeding with the negotiations. And he chose the election and he lost. Shimon Peres lost every single election he ever contested, you know. So, I mean, it was a tragedy.
Yes, and again, the Syrians, even after the Rabin assassination, they were willing to engage. That engagement continued. Madeleine Albright came to Damascus in September 1999 to pick up, to add momentum to the peace talks. Even Netanyahu sent a negotiator to negotiate. It was a track 2 diplomacy with the Syrians.
Ron Lauder, yeah.
Ron Lauder, yes, but that also failed. You know, am I entitled to ask a question or do I just answer? Because there's something that's always on my mind, which I think would be good for discussion with participants. The Syrians lost the Alexandretta territory that was occupied by Turkey in 1939, that was ceded by the French to Turkey.
Now known as Hatay province.
Now known as Hatay. And there was no disagreement on how Syrian that territory was. It was snatched out of Syria's official borders and given to Turkey. Yet, after 1939, there was no serious attempt at liberating that area. There were no military groups, there was no support for resistance. Very contrary to how Syria reacted to the occupation of Palestine in 1948, where from day one it started to support an underground movement and showed a very strong commitment to the liberation of Palestine. This was even before the Golan. I mean, you equate the Golan with the Sanjak, with Alexandretta. You do not equate Alexandretta with Palestine, which was another country that was occupied, being right on Syria's borders. And that shows you that Syrians really feel for the Palestinian issue. Again, you've got Palestinians who live here, who've been living here since 1948, who are intermarried with Syrians, and who have added to the relevance of their cause in Syrian public life.
I'm not sure that we can answer that, but it's a good question to put out
Okay.
there. And we will be discussing the Palestinian refugees in Syria in a later session of this series, which is great. So thanks for setting that one up. Alice, do you have another question?
Sure. This is from Peter Larson, and it's in a similar topic. It says, the professor thought that there could have been a peace treaty in 1990, but wouldn't that have meant selling out the Palestinian refugees and their demands?
No, that was not a condition by the Israelis. The Israelis were conditioning normalization and again, Hezbollah and Islamic Jihad. The issue of the Palestinian refugees was left for the Palestinians to negotiate, and it was Arafat who decided to leave it for later. And it kept on being delayed and delayed, the right of return. And it kept on being delayed and delayed until, again, it was touched upon in a very mediocre way by the Trump administration earlier this year. But the issue of refugees was not a condition for the Syrians and the Israelis to reach any agreement. It was the Syrians who were saying, we will not support the right of we will support the right of return, and we will not give these refugees Syrian passports, so that they do not forget that they belong to a country that they ought to be returning to.
Okay, here's a question from Irena Rajabedian. How come you were saying that Israel didn't want to continue regime change policy because they were seeing it's the Islamists leading the opposition? Israel has been supporting and funding Islamists from the beginning.
Israel was torn apart. At one point, again, it tried to create something similar to the South Liberation Army through those Islamists, South Lebanon Army, through those Islamists. But when it became clear that the upper hand was only in the hands of ISIS, known in the South as the Khalid ibn al-Walid Army, it started to have second thoughts. It wanted an opposition that it could control, an opposition that it could manipulate, and ISIS was not as easy as many people believe, and they believed that a regime change would lead to an ISIS takeover, whether in Damascus or in the south. So Israel might have supported Islamic groups, but it would not have supported an ISIS takeover or an Al-Qaeda takeover through Jabhat al-Nusra.
Okay, here's a question from Eric Resnick. How did it come to be that Syria became fodder in the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union?
That takes a long... Syria's choice was not, I mean, it was forced to side with the Russians because in 1949, as I mentioned at the start of this talk, the Americans, it was the Truman administration. They tried to force Syria to go into negotiations with Israel, which the Syrians refused. It tried to force the Syrians to strike out the Communist Party from public life, which the Syrians refused, and it tried to force the Syrians to give passage rights to American oil companies passing through Syrian territory. When all of that failed, they staged a coup. The staging of that coup put Syria squarely into the Cold War. You had one coup after another, and each coup would be supported by one great power or another. Up to the mid-1950s, the Americans tried to stage a coup in Syria. That coup failed. This is 1957. Resulting to the expulsion of the American ambassador and a full thrust into the hands of the Soviet Union. This was years before the Ba'ath came to power. It was even before the Syrian-Egyptian Union of 1958.
Okay, and from Peter Larson, can the professor say something about the Jews of Syria, both before 48 and after?
We're talking financial Jews?
No,
the Jews.
The Jews.
Syrian Jewish people.
Jews, of course. The Jews of Syria were always a very prominent segment of society who played a huge role in the economic recovery after World War I and after World War II. Life became very difficult for them. During the First Palestine War of 1948, they were suddenly excluded from the army and excluded from public life, and people began viewing them with scrutiny, which was very unjust, because these were Syrians with Syrian nationalism in their heart. Yet, and they continued to live in Syria all the way till 1994, when during the peace talks, the Clinton administration negotiated the exodus of what remained of Syrian Jews. The Syrian government said, yes, they can leave, but with the one condition that they don't go to Israel. So many of them ended up in the United States and in Canada. You would be surprised. Many people say that if there is no official number of how many Jews are left, it's a small number. You would be surprised that the last estimate I heard in Damascus was 70. Now that's a small number, but it's higher than the estimates that are making the round. They are elderly people, but you have to respect them because they stayed, although all countries and the United States were willing to accept them with open arms, and life became unbearable in the middle of the war, where there were electricity cuts and where there were mortars landing on their neighborhood, and they refused to leave their homes and the homes of their ancestors, and an entire neighborhood of the city, which is called Hayy al-Yahud, or the Jewish quarter of old Damascus. They're still there. Are they going to diminish in the future? Yes, because there are no young people. But I think they are a very undercovered topic in Syrian society.
Sami, you were telling me earlier that back in the early years of the 20th century, there were like Hebrew language publications in Damascus.
There was a newspaper that was established in early 1920 called Al-Sharq. It was established by a Jewish Damascene, who later on became a prominent figure in Israel after he immigrated, called Sasson, Eliyahu Sasson. And it came out in two languages, in Hebrew and in Arabic. It was discontinued when the French invaded Syria in July 1920. But the Jews were always prominent. They had a position in the Chamber of Commerce. They were always present in Parliament. In 1943, the Jewish deputy in Parliament was on the list of the nationalist president, Shukri al-Quwatli. That only began to change after 1948.
Interesting.
Okay, here's a question from Eric Resnick. Were it not for Israel's fear of Iran ending their nuclear hegemony, would Israel still have what they believe is cause to have Syria as an enemy?
Syria is an enemy for Israel. There's no doubt about that. This is even before the 1979 Islamic Revolution in Iran. And the Israelis have a multitude of reasons to believe that. Syria supported Fatah at one point, Islamic Jihad, the PFLP, GC, Hamas, Hezbollah, every kind of resistance group that you can imagine at one point in time lodged in Damascus. And that's the real reason why there is a great mistrust and animosity between Syria and Israel. This is not about Iran. Even if the Iranian regime would disappear now, that bad blood would remain between Tel Aviv and Damascus. I think it would be wrong, and we would be midgeting the Syrian-Israeli conflict to link it directly or link it solely to the Syrian-Iranian axis.
And do Syrians fear an Israeli invasion? I mean,
I don't think there is invasion of Syrian territory and occupation of new land. I think that's behind us, more so today than ever before, with the Russians there and the Iranians and the UNDOF back in power. I mean, in their positions. This could have happened in 2013 and 2014, when chaos was prevailing on the Syrian-Israeli border, and Israel did not do that at the time. Why would they invade? Would they invade to occupy new territory, or would they invade to go against Islamic groups? At that point in time, the Islamic groups that were on the border were not posing any threat to Israel. And now UNDOF is back.
Mhm. And from Pauline Kaufman, was the clean break document of the neocons and Israel a factor in this period?
Let me tell you something. The Syrians have not prioritized the Israeli problem in recent years, in as much as many people wanted to believe that Israel was a priority for Syrian decision makers, and there was a fear of Israel, or there was a desire to engage, or there was a serious study of what the Israelis were doing. If you just go through Syrian websites and Syrian media at the time, Israeli news were on the back burner. Government, opposition, and people alike were all way more interested in other stuff. Israel was not as relevant as it wanted to believe, or as many in the West would like to have believed during the past 10 years. The relevance is related directly to the war between Israel and Iran, if we're going to call it a war, to the conflict between Israel and Iran. But it's not as Syrian Israeli as it used to be in the past.
And here's a question. Lately, there have been alleged Israeli airstrikes on suspected chemical weapons, plants, and homes. Is Israel afraid of chemical weapons in Syria?
Of course it was, and it's made that clear. This is not an assumption. This is based on Israeli statements. They've always feared chemical weapons, and they were behind many of the statements or the studies that estimated how big and powerful Syria's chemical arsenal is.
Okay, and here's another question. Lastly, is there a possibility of a trade-off between Iranian withdrawal from Syria, as Israel demands, and returning to Syria of the occupied Golan?
The withdrawal of Iranian forces from Syria would have to be a Syrian, Iranian, Russian project. It cannot be officially part of a Syrian-Israeli peace agreement, or it cannot be put on the table as a negotiating condition, simply because the Syrians alone cannot achieve it. It's not a one-way decision. In the past, it was you have to distance yourself from Hezbollah. The Syrians could have done that if they were given the Golan back in full. But now getting Iran to withdraw requires two people to tango. It requires Damascus and Tehran to engage. If the Iranians are not interested in a withdrawal, and if they don't get something in return for that withdrawal in their negotiations with the Americans in the West, it's not going to happen. So I don't think it's very logical to intertwine all these issues into one package. Each has to be unwinded separately.
And is it true that Lebanon also has something to lose, Jabba Farms in Al Jabal, Golan, should the Israeli continue its militant occupation?
The Shab'a farms are Lebanese territory, and there's a debate on whether they're Syrian or Lebanese, but there is occupied territory that needs to be liberated, and until that happens, there is going to be a military group called Hezbollah in Lebanon carrying arms, being the most powerful player in Lebanon, whether we like it or not. More so today with the collapse of everything in that country due to the economic crisis and the financial meltdown that's happening. Unless you have a withdrawal from the Shab'a farms, it will be very difficult to negotiate anything on the Lebanon Hezbollah arsenal. And every single cabinet that has been created in Lebanon, from the present one of Hassan Diab, even through the pro-Western ones like Saad al-Hariri and Fuad al-Sanyora, have pledged to, quote unquote, support and embrace the arms of Hezbollah. That doesn't mean they like it. It means they have no other option, because Hezbollah is the most powerful player in that country. That's a matter of fact.
So I think we have time just for 2 more questions, Alice, and then we need to wrap things up. But this has been fascinating.
Thank you.
Let's see. So what was and what still is the role of Saudi Arabia in the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians and the conflict between Israel and Syria?
At this stage, you have huge animosity between Saudi Arabia and Hamas, because Hamas is the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, which Saudi Arabia accuses of creating havoc and stirring terrorism in the Arabian Gulf. Historically speaking, Saudi Arabia was on excellent relations with Yasser Arafat, and it supported him generously with funds. Those funds ended because of Arafat's August 1990 support for Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait. The Saudis came up with a peace initiative in March 2002 called the Prince Abdullah, later King Abdullah Peace Initiative, which was adopted by the Arab League, which called for collective peace between Arab states and Israel in exchange for collective withdrawal from all occupied territory. At the time, if you recall, Ariel Sharon responded by refusing to allow Arafat to leave his besieged compound in Ramallah, and raided Ramallah and took the level of violence to unprecedented levels in what then was the Second Intifada. So that was a clear response from Israel that it is not interested in the Saudi peace initiative. At this stage, there is at one point in time, the Saudis were supporting the Syrian opposition. I think that's now history, more so. It started to become history after the 2015 death of King Abdullah and the start of the Saudi-Yemen war, which took Saudi attention to a completely new level. Right now, the Gulf is way more interested in rooting out the Muslim Brotherhood, which gives them common ground for any rapprochement with Damascus.
Okay, and I think this is the last question. Can you comment on the arming and supporting of militants and launching air raids against Syria from Israel?
The Israeli arming of militants?
Right.
The Israelis, again, early on during the Syrian war, they took a step back, waiting to see how things would go. Everybody was believing at the time that the regime was going to fall in a matter of weeks, months. And it did support the opposition, and it did support the arming of the opposition, like many countries did, not realizing that this was going to lead to a overwhelmingly jihadi Islamic opposition. Even then, they continued to give their support to certain military groups, so that the Americans, who were vetted at the time as quote unquote moderate opposition. The real game changer was the emergence of ISIS in 2014, the creation of the caliphate in Mosul, and the famous speech by Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, which caused all states in the region and abroad to reconsider their positions on Syria. And I think Israel was no exception to that.
So thank you very much indeed. Dr. Sami Moubayed, I hope things go well for you there in your lockdown in Damascus.
Thank you, Helena. Thank you, Alice, and thank you all for having me. It's been a pleasure. It's actually very healthy to engage in dialogue, healthy dialogue. For the past 2 weeks, most of my dialogue has been with my 2-year-old baby. So
that is how lockdowns are. I know my children tell me that their children are a constant presence in their lockdown. So I hope things go well for you. Really, it's been an honor to have you with us.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure and my honor as well.
Now, I want to remind all the listeners that we'll be continuing to hold these webinars on Wednesdays and Saturdays at 1 p.m. New York City time from now through April 25th. Next Saturday, I'm going to share this screen. I'm going to nail this screen sharing thing, people. Okay. So next Saturday, I'll be talking to two great experts on the regional dynamics of the fighting in Syria, Elijah Magnier and Sharmin Narwani. At the end of today's session, when we close it, or you click on the Leave Webinar button, don't click on it yet, that's at the bottom right of your screen, Zoom will be sending you a little questionnaire inviting your feedback and evaluation of today's session. Please do fill out and send in those evaluations. And today's session, like the preceding four, has been recorded for us by Zoom. We're currently building a permanent zone on our website where we're posting the links to all the videos and related materials to be a continuing resource for people going forward. Oops, share screen again. How do I do that? Okay, So this is how you can find the other resources that we have available. The top link there takes you to our resource page. Keep checking back as we load more material onto it and as we get it better organized. Finally, let me note that we're providing this whole webinar series at no cost to attendees so that we can win the largest possible audience for it. If you find the project worthwhile, please send us as generous of a donation as you can. Big thanks to everybody who's already given to us over the past few weeks. Now you can donate either online or via check by clicking the donate button on our website at www.justworldeducational.org. Thanks for being with us here today. Stay safe and be sure to join us for Saturday's session with Elijah Magnier and Sharmin Narwani. Thank you, everybody, and until Saturday. Goodbye, Sami.
Bye-bye.